In the year 1860, deep in the autumn cold of Poland, the forests whispered with the sound of dying leaves. The villages slept under fog, and the old stone churches tolled like hollow warnings, but in one noble estate, a wedding bell did not ring in celebration, it rang like a death knell. That night, as the moon poured pale silver onto the frozen ground, people in the surrounding countryside saw fire blooming on the horizon. A castle, magnificent, ancient, built on centuries of blood and land, was burning from within. The villagers rushed to the gates, their lanterns bobbing in the mist. But the doors were locked from the inside, and the screams that bled out from the high windows were not the shouts of soldiers or peasants. They were the desperate wails of young noblemen in their finest suits. The bride, they would later whisper, had locked her grooms inside and set the halls aflame. Her white dress, it was said, glowed red in the inferno. At first, people refused to believe it. How could a single woman, delicate and fair, orchestrate such devastation? Yet the fire consumed not just one hall, but the hearts of men who had courted her. They said she smiled when the towers collapsed, as if she were not a bride, but an executioner. Some said she was possessed. Others believed she was a servant of the old Slavic gods, those dark, forgotten deities buried under Catholic rituals. But the oldest villagers said something else entirely, that she was a mirror held up to Poland itself. A land that had been carved, divided and betrayed by empires. A land that had lost its honor and now burned those who sought to rule it. This story, buried in church records and whispered in rural legends, was not about marriage. It was about power, about corruption, about the kind of hunger that wears a veil and smiles sweetly before feeding on the soul of its prey. The noble families of Europe tried to hide her name, to erase her from memory. But ashes leave stains and fire leaves shadows on the wall long after the smoke clears. Tonight I will drag her from the shadows. Tonight you will hear what you were never meant to hear, and once you hear it, you cannot go back. The year was 1860, but Poland was not truly Poland. It was a land carved apart, suffocating under the boots of empires. The Russians, the Prussians, the Austrians, all had taken their share. And yet in the countryside, among the foggy forests and crumbling castles, life went on in strange silence. The peasants tilled the frozen soil, priests whispered sermons about obedience, and the noble families, though stripped of their great power, still clung to their rituals, their estates, and their illusions of dignity. It was in this world of fracture and false order that the legend of the burning bride emerged. You must imagine it carefully. A castle sitting at the edge of a barren forest, its stones blackened with centuries of smoke. Inside its chambers, a wedding feast was prepared, silver plates gleaming, candles flickering against velvet drapes. Guests in formal coats and gowns raised glasses of wine and spoke of politics, inheritance, and alliances. A wedding was not only a union of two people, it was the currency of survival. A noble family married to another could buy protection, influence, or salvation from ruin. But in the eyes of the villagers who stood beyond the castle gates, none of it felt real. They said the castle windows looked like hollow eyes, watching them with contempt. They said that at night the forests around the estate grew unnaturally still, as if the animals themselves refused to trespass, and they whispered that the bride had been chosen not for love, but as a weapon, a union designed to weld power. A pact written not in ink, but in blood. The peasants, of course, were not invited to witness the vows, but they claimed they heard the laughter that night, strange laughter echoing across the fog. And when the fire came, some swore it was no ordinary blaze. It burned too fast, too fiercely, as if it had been called from some other place. And when the smoke cleared, all that was left was a carcass of stone. No groom, no guests, no wedding song, only charred bones in the rubble, and a bride whose name no one dared to say aloud. This is the foundation of the story. A land enslaved, nobles pretending to rule, and a single woman who shattered the illusion with fire. Her act was more than murder. It was a message, and to understand it, you must be willing to walk further into the darkness. And if you feel ready to take the next step and become part of this journey, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. The woman at the center of this tale was known in fractured records only as Katarzyna of Brześć. Some called her noble, others swore she was little more than a pawn adopted into privilege. What we do know is this: she was raised in a house where silence was law, where women were to be beautiful but voiceless, and where every glance was measured against the worth of property and bloodline. From a young age, she was groomed not for happiness but for strategy. Her body was a dowry, her future a transaction. And yet, there are accounts, servants' notes, confessions whispered decades later, that Katarzyna was different. She did not bow her head at prayers. She refused to sing hymns. They said she wandered into the forests at night, barefoot, even in the frost, and spoke to no one for hours. They said her eyes never softened, even when she smiled. There is one chilling recollection written in the diary of a parish priest. When I asked her what she dreamed of, she replied, "I dream of burning the masks from men's faces." Imagine the fear this inspired in an age where women were chained by religion and politics. A bride was meant to secure obedience, not to ignite rebellion. But Katarzyna carried something inside her, a hatred so precise it looked like clarity. She saw the hypocrisy of her father, who spoke of faith while secretly trading favors with occupying officials. She saw the greed of noblemen who toasted Poland's freedom in public but sold it for land in private. And she saw the hollow men who courted her, one by one, believing that her hand would secure their dying bloodlines. Every suitor who came through her gates left speaking of her beauty, but also of her silence. She gave them little, but when her gaze fell on them, it was said to be unbearable, like she could strip the skin from their faces with her eyes alone. And yet they pursued her, blindly, because to marry her was to marry into legacy. They saw wealth, not warning. They saw inheritance, not execution. And so the stage was set, a young woman who hated her gilded cage, a string of grooms who thought they could claim her, and a castle filled with illusions about to be torn apart by fire. The question still whispered in rural Poland is whether Katarzyna was a victim lashing out, or something far darker, summoned to be the punishment of men. At first, the stories around Katarzyna seemed like fragments, unconnected whispers carried through the village. A missing servant girl here, a guest who fell ill there, a neighbor who swore they saw torchlight moving in the forest when the castle windows were dark. The authorities dismissed it as gossip, but the peasants believed otherwise. They said the castle walls absorbed secrets, and that every brick of its foundation was heavy with something unholy. It began subtly. Suitors came to the estate eager to win her hand, but some never returned. Their families were told they had left on business, or that they had fallen ill and died in distant cities. But the peasants muttered about the strange smoke rising from the castle chimneys at night, even when no feast was being prepared. Then came the illnesses. One by one, young men from the neighboring manors complained of burning fevers after visiting Katarzyna's halls. Their skin broke out in rashes, their eyes yellowed, their breath rattled like old pipes. Doctors declared it an infection, a passing sickness. But the priests whispered that it was a curse, carried not by air or water, but by something far older, something carried in her very presence. There were conflicting reports. Some claimed Katarzyna was seen kneeling in the chapel, pale and serene, praying with such devotion it brought tears to the priest's eyes. Others swore she was seen in the forest at night, barefoot in the snow, whispering to shadows that moved without wind. A midwife testified years later that she found strange sigils carved under the bedposts of the bridal chamber, symbols older than Christianity, marks of fire and binding. The villagers began to avoid the estate entirely. Even the beggars who usually lingered near noble gates for scraps vanished from its path. Yet the nobles of Poland ignored the warnings. They were too desperate, too blinded by politics and inheritance. To them, Katarzyna was not a danger. She was opportunity. They lined up, suitor after suitor, each one believing he would be the one to tame her. But the fire was waiting. It was not sudden, not random. It was prepared. Every strange disappearance, every sickness, every symbol in the dark. They were steps leading to one single night when the mask of marriage would fall and the true ritual would begin. The whispers became impossible to ignore when the wedding invitations were sent. Katarzyna was to marry one of the wealthiest heirs in the region, a man whose family had deep ties to the Austrian court. For the nobles, this was a triumph, a chance to secure influence in a time when Poland itself was carved like meat at a table of empires. For the peasants, it was the tolling of a funeral bell. They said the bride's hand was no gift. It was a blade wrapped in silk. As the day approached, strange omens multiplied. Horses bolted at the gates and refused to cross the threshold. Candles inside the chapel refused to stay lit, as if the air itself choked the flame. The cook's assistant was found dead in the cellar, eyes wide open, body cold, with no mark of violence. Servants whispered of a smell that lingered in the halls, sharp like sulfur, bitter like burned iron. The priests brought relics, crosses, holy water, but nothing seemed to linger. The walls of the castle swallowed prayer like dry soil swallows rain. And Katarzyna, she was never more radiant. She walked through the halls as if untouchable, her pale skin glowing in the torchlight, her lips curved in a smile that unsettled even her father's most trusted men. Witnesses said she seemed too calm, too rehearsed, as if she had already seen the outcome of the wedding night. When asked if she feared the union, she reportedly said, "Fear is for those who are trapped. I am the fire that frees them." The day of the wedding was strange from the start. The morning sky was black with crows, their wings beating so thickly they nearly blotted out the light. Guests arrived uneasy, but were greeted with music, wine, and banquets that masked their dread. The bride moved like a vision, dressed in white, her hair braided with pearls, but those who saw her eyes swore they were not the eyes of a maiden, they were the eyes of a judge, cold and merciless. That night, after the vows, after the feast, when the music softened and the torches dimmed, the guests raised their glasses in a final toast. Then came the first scream from deep within the hall, then another and another, until the entire castle shook with terror. The doors were barred, the windows sealed, and outside, the villagers watched as fire erupted from within, consuming the night like a ritual long prepared. The villagers stood in the mist, their lanterns trembling in their hands as the castle turned into a furnace. The flames roared from the high windows like beasts freed from chains, glass shattered, spilling molten shards into the night. The noblemen inside screamed, not like warriors but like children, their voices raw and broken, carried on the wind across the valley. Those who tried to escape found the doors chained shut from the inside. Witnesses swore they saw shadows moving across the windows, clawing, pounding, desperate hands slamming against the glass before vanishing into fire. The music had stopped. The laughter had stopped. Only the sound of burning, of collapsing beams, of silk gowns igniting like paper filled the night. The peasants tried to force their way through the iron gates, but the locks held, and those who touched the doors screamed in pain. The metal seared hot, too hot for hands to hold. Horses reared and fled, dragging wagons into the forest. Even the dogs refused to approach, howling and pulling at their chains. And then, as if orchestrated, the flames shifted. Witnesses later described something unnatural. The fire moved not randomly but with rhythm, consuming hall after hall in precise sequence, as though guided by an unseen hand. First the banquet hall, then the chapel, then the guest chambers. It burned like judgment, and at the heart of it all, silhouetted in the highest window, villagers claimed they saw her. The bride, Katarzyna. Her dress glowing in the inferno, her arms raised as if conducting the fire itself. The priests who arrived later tried to explain it away. They said it was hysteria, illusion, shadows playing tricks. But the villagers never doubted what they saw. She did not scream. She did not run. She stood as the flames consumed everything around her, her face lit in terrible serenity. When the fire finally died and the sun rose over the blackened ruins, investigators found nothing but charred bones and scorched stone. The groom was gone. The guests were gone, the noble line reduced to ash in a single night. But there was one detail that froze the blood of even the hardest men. No remains of the bride were ever found, not a bone, not a tooth, not a trace, as if the fire had spared her or carried her away. When the smoke cleared and the castle was reduced to a skeleton of stone, the world rushed in to explain it away. Newspapers in Warsaw and Krakow reported it as an accident, a tragedy of poor construction, of faulty candles, of drunken revelers who allowed fire to consume them. They named it misfortune, not malice. They erased the whispers of villagers, erased the memory of screams, and erased the bride herself from the record. But the peasants told another story. They gathered at the ruins, clutching their rosaries, crossing themselves as they described what they saw. They spoke of her silhouette in the flames. They spoke of the chained doors, the sealed windows. They swore the fire burned with intent, as if summoned. Their stories spread like wildfire through the countryside, but each time officials arrived, silence fell. Those who spoke too openly were punished, their words dismissed as superstition, their warnings branded treasonous. Poland was already fractured by foreign powers. There was no tolerance for tales that hinted at rebellion or curses. The church too intervened. Priests visited the ruins and performed blessings, sprinkling holy water on scorched stone, yet some admitted in private that the soil refused to hold the blessing. Candles extinguished themselves. The wind howled through the broken halls like a living thing. The bishop of the region declared that the tragedy must never be spoken of again. Officially, the bride never existed. The estate was to remain abandoned, a scar no one could touch. But memory cannot be sealed. Survivors of the feast, few as they were, spoke in trembling voices. A guard who had been stationed outside, too far to enter the fire, testified that he said, "To Bibi Katarzyna walking calmly down the back stairway before the flames spread. He said she carried something in her hands, a book bound in dark leather." Another servant claimed he saw her vanish into the forest, her white gown unmarked by ash, her steps leaving no trace in the mud. Their testimonies were suppressed, locked away in archives, stamped with the seal of silence. And yet the legend persisted. Villagers began to call her not Katarzyna, but the Bride of Ashes. They said she did not die in the fire, she was born in it. They believed she had burned not just a castle, but the very masks of power worn by men. To speak her name became dangerous, but still in whispers they told their children, "Beware the bride who burns what she is forced to embrace." History is not written by truth, it is written by survival. That is why Katarzyna's story was not celebrated, not investigated, not memorialized. It was buried. For the nobles, admitting what had happened would have exposed their weakness. For the church, it would have revealed cracks in their authority. For the empires that ruled Poland, it would have been a spark of rebellion too dangerous to let live. So the chronicles spoke of an accidental fire, and the name of the bride was dissolved into silence. But silence has weight. The more they tried to erase her, the more the story grew in the minds of the peasants. They began to speak of her not just as a woman, but as a force, an embodiment of rebellion against a world built on corruption. Some whispered that she had struck a bargain with something older than Christ, something older than the crosses in their chapels. Others believed she was not damned but chosen, that her fire was judgment on the false rulers who had enslaved their land. This is why she frightened them, not because she killed, but because she revealed. Because her act was not madness, it was clarity. She showed that behind every noble banquet lay greed, that behind every vow lay betrayal, that behind every institution, be it state or church, was the stench of rot. And once you see that rot, once you inhale its bitter smoke, you cannot return to blindness. The suppression itself was a weapon. The papers printed lies. Priests rewrote sermons. Officials sealed archives with wax and threat. They told the people, forget. But forgetting is a form of slavery, and some refused. In taverns, in fields, in candlelit kitchens, the whispers carried on. Katarzyna became a ghost not of flesh, but of truth, a phantom that haunted the edges of every ritual of power. Ask yourself, why do they still teach us the myths of kings, but not the truths of those who burned them? Why do we memorize wars and treaties, but not the names of women who set fire to castles? Why are we fed illusions of loyalty and obedience, while the stories that could make us see clearly are buried under stone? This is no accident, it is design. The suppression of Katarzyna's name was not about her, it was about us, about what men might do if they remembered. The official report said the ruins contained nothing but ash and bone, but buried deeper in parish archives and private diaries are fragments, accounts so disturbing that they were never meant for the public eye. One investigator, a minor official from Lublin, recorded that among the rubble they found not only human remains but objects that should not have been there. Strange carvings on the stone walls revealed only when the plaster burned away. Symbols older than Christianity, etched into the very foundation of the bridal chamber. Circles of fire, runes of binding, marks that scholars later compared to the rituals of the old pagan cults of the Slavs. And then there was the book, mentioned only once, in a confiscated letter written by a shaken priest. He described it as bound in dark leather, its pages filled with script he did not recognize. He claimed it smelled of smoke and salt, and that when he touched it, his hands blistered as if burned. The letter was intercepted, sealed, and never spoken of again. But fragments of the priest's words survive. She was no victim of fire. She was its author. Villagers claimed they saw bones in unnatural positions, as if the dead had not fallen but had been arranged. Hands clasped as if in ritual prayer, bodies aligned in circles around the center of the hall. Others swore that no remains of certain guests were ever found at all, as if they had simply vanished, taken whole by the flame. The most disturbing claim came from a soldier sent to guard the site. He confessed, years later, that in the days after the fire, he heard voices echoing in the ruins. Not the moans of survivors, but whispers, rhythmic, like chants. They came at night, when the moonlight fell across the blackened stones. He deserted his post rather than endure another night listening to voices that belonged to no living man. These details were smothered, of course. The public was told nothing. The documents vanished into locked vaults. And yet they confirm what the villagers already believed. The fire was not random. It was a ritual, a cleansing, an act of power disguised as tragedy. Katarzyna did not simply destroy a castle. She performed something older, something forbidden. And if such rituals can erase men of power in a single night, what does that tell us about the true foundations of the world we live in? The greatest fire was not the one that consumed the castle. It was the one that consumed the truth. For in the weeks after the ashes cooled, the empires that carved Poland understood the danger. A single woman had reduced noble bloodlines to dust, and if her name spread, others might awaken to the same thought. That power was not untouchable. That the walls of palaces could be burned as easily as wood. And so the institutions moved quickly. The newspapers printed lies of candle accidents, drunken feasts, and tragic misfortune. Priests delivered sermons about obedience, warning their congregations that gossip was a sin and that to speak of the bride of ashes was to risk damnation. Schools erased her name, archives sealed her record. It was a silence sharpened like a blade, meant to sever the memory before it spread. Why? Because they understood the psychology of men. They knew that fear could be contained, but inspiration could not. A murderer terrifies, but a rebel inspires. Katarzyna was not seen as a madwoman. She was seen as a mirror, reflecting the corruption of the age back at itself. If her story survived, it could ignite not only fires in castles, but fires in the hearts of those who served beneath them. This is how power operates, not through truth, but through narrative. They feed you the stories they want you to believe, stories of kings chosen by God, of noble sacrifices, of institutions protecting the weak, but they bury the stories that show cracks in the illusion. They erase the names of those who reveal that rulers are human, frail, and corruptible. And when they cannot erase, they distort. Katarzyna became a ghost story, a cautionary tale stripped of her reality. In time they made her a monster, a witch, a fiend of pagan fires. Anything but what she truly was, a woman who saw through the mask and acted. Think about your own life. What truths have been hidden from you under the name of order? What histories have been rewritten so that you remain obedient, so that you never question the walls around you? The Bride of Ashes is not just a woman in 1860 Poland. She is a symbol of every truth they sealed, every rebellion they smothered, every fire they extinguished before it could spread. And here you are, listening. Already, you are outside the circle of silence they built. They said she vanished in the flames. They said no trace of her body was ever found, and from that absence was born a darker presence, the belief that she survived. In the countryside, peasants whispered that Katarzyna walked the forests at night, barefoot, her gown unburned, her hair trailing smoke. Children were told not to wander after sunset, for the Bride of Ashes would claim them if they strayed too close to the ruins. But the stories did not stop with fear. Some believed she became something more than human, an avenger, a judge. They said widows saw her face in their dreams, whispering of husbands who would never return. They said men who mistreated their brides woke to find their barns burned, their cattle gone, their houses blackened with soot. Others claimed that on nights when the wind was sharp and dry, you could see her figure in the distance, standing in fields, waiting, watching. And then came the stranger stories. Travelers swore they met a woman on the road, tall, pale, veiled, who asked for directions but never left footprints. A soldier recalled being approached by a woman in white who pressed a coin into his hand, engraved with symbols he could not recognize. When he tried to spend it, the coin vanished, leaving only soot in his palm. The church, desperate to contain the spreading folklore, began to twist her tale into warnings. Priests thundered from pulpits that she was no woman but a demon, that she had been seduced by the old gods, the forgotten deities buried beneath Catholic stone, that her fire was hellfire, her silence a pact with the devil himself. Yet even in their condemnation they could not kill her story. For what they called a demon, the peasants called justice. And so her legend grew. The noblemen feared her, the church cursed her, but the common people began to see her as a symbol. A woman who refused to kneel, a woman who burned the chains that bound her, a woman who, whether alive or dead, haunted the powerful. This is how forbidden figures survive, not in books, not in official histories, but in whispers and dreams. Katarzyna was erased from the records, but she lived on in the one place power could not touch, the memory of those who still felt the heat of her fire. Katarzyna's fire was not alone. If you look closely, if you pull back the veil of official history, you will see that her story is part of a pattern, a shadow lineage of women erased, demonized, or buried, because they carried within them the same spark that terrified the institutions of power. In Germany, they whispered of Anna Goldie, the last so-called witch executed in 1782, who cursed her oppressors with visions before they hanged her. In France, stories lingered of aristocratic brides who poisoned their husbands in secret pacts, silenced by guillotine before their truths spread. In Hungary, the name of Countess Bathory was stained with tales of blood, yet behind the horror was a noble woman too powerful for men to control. Was she a monster? Or was she rewritten into one? Katarzyna belongs to this forbidden sisterhood, women who broke the roles written for them. In a Europe shackled by empire, religion, and patriarchy, such figures could not be allowed to exist as human. They had to be recast as demons, monsters, witches, because a rebel inspires, but a monster terrifies, and terror is easier to control than admiration. The fire at Brest was explained as accident. The bodies were explained as tragedy, and Katarzyna herself, she was explained away as nothing but myth. But if she was only myth, why did so many other myths resemble her? Why do so many legends across Europe speak of veiled brides, of pale women in forests, of fires that burn down houses of power in the night? It is the same story, told again and again. A woman who refuses, who breaks, who burns. A figure who forces the world to see its own corruption, if only for a moment, in the reflection of fire. And every time the story is suppressed, every time the narrative is twisted, every time she is buried under names that do not belong to her, witch, demon, monster, But what if they were never monsters at all? What if they were what Katazan was mirrors? Mirrors that power feared to look into, because once you see yourself stripped bare, greed, corruption, hypocrisy, you cannot pretend to be holy again. And so, across Europe, the flames of forgotten women flickered. Katazina's was only one of them, but hers was among the brightest. Years after the fire, the castle still stood as a husk of blackened stone, its towers fractured, its halls gutted. Grass would not grow there, birds would not nest. Travelers avoided the road that passed its gates, preferring to walk miles through forest rather than feel the wind that blew through its hollow windows. They called it cursed, but what they meant was, it remembered. Those who dared to enter told chilling stories. They said the air inside was never warm, not even in summer. They said footsteps echoed long after one had stopped walking, as if others walked unseen behind you. They swore that if you struck a match in the ruins, the flame would flare high and then die, no matter how much oil you carried. And the most disturbing tales came from those who lingered near the collapsed banquet hall. Some swore they heard voices, faint at first, then louder, screams, laughter, prayers, all tangled together, a cacophony of the wedding night, replaying itself endlessly. A farmer once reported that he saw a white figure standing in the highest window frame, though that tower had collapsed years before. He fled and never returned. Children dared each other to run to the castle walls at night, and those who did claimed they saw glowing embers where the chapel once stood, as if the fire had never truly died. The church tried to ban visits to the ruins, declaring the site spiritually unclean. Soldiers patrolled for a time, but even they grew uneasy. One patrolman wrote in a hidden letter that he heard chanting in a language he did not understand, though no one was there. He quit his service within the month. And still, year after year, peasants laid offerings at the gates, bread, flowers, coins, not out of fear alone, but out of reverence. They whispered prayers not to God, but to Katazina, asking her to watch over their daughters, to punish cruel men, to bring fire to oppressors. The ruins became more than stone. They became a shrine, a forbidden altar to a forbidden bride. The authorities did everything to erase her, but the land itself refused. The castle did not simply burn, it lived on as a wound, and wounds, when ignored, fester into something far worse. The rulers did not waste the legend, they twisted it into a tool. For them, Katazina was no longer just a ghost bride haunting burned stone. She was a warning, reshaped, sharpened, and aimed at the very people who had once whispered her name in prayer. Priests preached from pulpits, "Beware the bride in flames, for she hunts the wicked and the faithless. She waits for those who disobey." The nobility whispered rumors in court that she had been born of Satan, a demon in white silk, sent to lure men to hell. They spread paintings in taverns, crude sketches of a veiled woman with blackened hands reaching for the throats of drunkards. They turned Katazina into a parable. If you rise against your masters, you will be destroyed and your memory desecrated. It worked. Fear spread. Mothers scolded daughters not to speak too freely, not to disobey, or "the burning bride will take you." Fathers warned sons not to wander near the ruins, lest her ghost brand them with fire. What was once reverence became silence. What was once prayer became trembling. But fear is a double-edged blade. The rulers tried to use her as a scarecrow, yet they planted seeds of obsession. Young men dreamed of her, waking in cold sweat. Girls whispered at night about how Katazina burned those who wronged her, and some smiled when they said it. The more they tried to twist her legend into a monster's tale, the more it slipped through their hands. And so the story was buried deeper. Record has vanished from archives. Officials forbade her name in writing. Villagers caught speaking of her were punished, but none of it erased the image of the white veil, the crackle of flames, the unblinking eyes in the dark. For what is buried in shadow grows roots, what is denied becomes desire, and what is suppressed becomes obsession. By trying to erase Katazina, they ensured she would never truly die. They weaponized her against the people, but in doing so, they gave her a new form, one beyond their control, A myth cannot be chained, and a myth that carries fire cannot be extinguished. By the 1870s, whispers began to surface of gatherings in barns, in forest clearings, in ruined chapels where no priest dared to enter. They were not Christian masses, not pagan feasts. They were something else, something born of Katarzyna's ashes. The peasants who still revered her no longer prayed aloud in daylight. They met at night, when the moon was veiled and the wind carried the sound of rustling branches. They placed a white veil on a wooden effigy draped in burned cloth and set candles at its feet. They offered bread, coins, and locks of hair, asking Katarzyna to protect them from cruel husbands, landlords, and soldiers. Some spoke her name 3 times into the flame of a candle, believing she would walk beside them unseen. Others carved her symbol, a circle with a single flame at its heart, into door frames, barns, even their own skin. To them, she was not a demon, nor a monster. She was justice in fire, a force that answered when God looked away. The authorities caught wind of this and called it witchcraft. But the gatherings spread anyway. In some villages, every woman in a family line joined, passing down the rituals like secret recipes. They sang songs not found in any hymn book. They told their daughters that if a man tried to cage them, Katarzyna would strike the cage with fire. What terrified the rulers most was not the worship itself, it was the loyalty. These peasants were more afraid of betraying Katarzyna than of the church. They would lie, steal, even kill before they would abandon her rights. A priest once tried to infiltrate one of these midnight meetings, only to vanish without trace. His cloak was later found at the edge of the ruins, smoldering as though burned from within. Officials blamed bandits, but the villagers said nothing, not out of fear of law, but out of devotion to the bride in flames. And so a cult was born, not one of shrieking madness, but of quiet, burning faith. A faith carried in whispers, in candle smoke, in the silence of eyes that would not look away. The rulers thought they had turned her into a monster. Instead, they had made her into a goddess. It began with whispers, then with accidents, then with flames that no one could explain. A barn belonging to a cruel tax collector erupted in fire one night, though no lantern had been lit, no spark had been struck. The villagers said nothing, but their eyes gleamed when questioned. A merchant who had cheated widows saw his home burn to the ground in a stormless night, and his charred body was found clutching coins melted into his flesh. Officials wrote these events off as misfortune, but the pattern grew too sharp to ignore. They said Katarzyna had returned, not in flesh, not as ghost, but in her followers, those who lit torches in silence, those who whispered her name while striking a flint. Soon, fire became her language, her scripture. Entire communities learned to send messages through flames. A stack of hay ignited at midnight meant vengeance had been delivered. A field burned at the edge of town meant judgment was near. The cult no longer prayed only in secret. They acted, and every act deepened their faith. When a miller beat his daughter to force her into marriage, the wheelhouse caught fire before dawn. When a soldier abused the villagers, his body was found in the ruins of a watchtower, smoke still rising. No one saw who struck the flame. No one confessed. But everyone knew. The church called it heresy, the rulers called it rebellion, the peasants called it justice, and justice, in those dark years, wore the veil of a bride and carried the torch of Katarzyna. Soon a rumor spread. Those who set these fires claimed they felt no fear, no guilt, only calm, as though guided by invisible hands. Some swore they heard her voice in the crackle of burning wood. Others claimed to see her face in the smoke, veiled, watching, approving. The authorities tried to stamp it out with executions. Men and women were hanged, their corpses left swinging in the town square, but each death only fueled the fire further. For every torch extinguished, 3 more were lit. What began as a myth had become a movement. What began as a bride's vengeance had become a people's rebellion, wrapped in flame. And with every fire, her legend grew stronger. Katarzyna was no longer a ghost haunting ruins. She was a force, an idea, and an idea, once ignited, spreads like wildfire. Behind the stone walls of palaces, Katarzyna's name was spoken with trembling lips. At first, nobles laughed, calling her a ghost story for peasants, a myth born of drunken fear. But when their barns burned, when their soldiers vanished, when entire estates smoldered in the night, the laughter ended. What terrified them most was not the fire itself. It was the silence that followed. No witness, no suspect, no explanation. Just ash. Meetings were held in candlelit chambers. Documents circulated in secret, marked with seals of empire, stamped for eyes only. Ministers debated, was this witchcraft? Was it rebellion? Or was it something worse, an invisible system of loyalty, a faith the church could not touch? The very thought chilled them. One governor wrote that Katarzyna represented a contagion of the mind. He warned that once people believed the burning bride watched over them, no threat of gallows could break them. Fear of death vanished, replaced by devotion to flame. In his words, how do you fight an army, Taunton? Hat D's willingly for a ghost. The church sent exorcists to the ruins. They returned broken, muttering that the ground itself rejected holy water, that prayers froze on their tongues. Bishops held councils on whether the bride was demon or saint, but they dared not publish their debates. To admit her power was to admit the weakness of their own God. And yet, some of the rulers were fascinated. In hidden libraries, scholars studied her legend, dissected the rituals, mapped the fires like battlefields. They wanted to know, could this fire be bent? Could this faith be weaponized, controlled, directed? For what ruler would not desire an army of zealots who obey without question, who burn without hesitation, who fight even after death? But power built on stolen fire always backfires. The more they studied, the more they feared. A noble who dared to commission a portrait of Katarzyna in her veil was found dead weeks later, his mansion burned from within. A general who spoke of harnessing her legend for war died screaming in his sleep, his bed aflame though no candle was near. The rulers discovered what the peasants already knew. Katarzyna was no servant to be used. She was not a tool, not a weapon to be commanded. She was fire, and fire does not bow. Among the peasants, not all who followed Katarzyna merely worshipped. Some claimed she had entered them, not as a ghost whispering from the ruins, but as a presence inside their very blood. They called themselves the Vessels, and their testimonies still haunt the margins of forbidden archives. One woman, a widow beaten half to death by her landlord, stood in the center of her village and declared, "She walks with me now, her breath is my breath, her fire is my heart." That night, the landlord's granary ignited without spark or torch, reducing his wealth to blackened ruin. The widow was never arrested. No one dared. A farmer, trembling with fever, told a traveling priest that Katarzyna came to him in dreams. She stood at the edge of his field, her veil glowing like embers. She reached out her hand, and when he woke, his palm bore a burn that had never touched flame. Days later, he slaughtered his abusive overseer and set the man's house alight, laughing as the flames consumed it. He swore afterward he felt no guilt, only peace, as though the act had been done not by him, but through him. Others described even stranger symptoms, sudden visions of fire where none burned, hearing footsteps behind them in empty rooms, tasting smoke on their tongue at night. Some could not sleep, because every time they closed their eyes, they saw her face in the dark, watching, waiting, judging. To outsiders, these were signs of madness. To the cult, these were signs of blessing. A chosen vessel was not feared but revered. Villagers gave them food, shelter, protection. They became leaders, prophets, executioners of justice. In towns where a vessel appeared, crime vanished overnight, for all knew that Katarzyna's eyes were present and her punishment would be swift. Yet there was a price. Vessels rarely lived long. Some wasted away, consumed by visions. Others burned, literally, set alight in their beds, their bodies reduced to ash before help could arrive. And yet each death was seen not as tragedy, but as ascension. "The bride has taken her own back," the villagers whispered, kneeling in reverence before the smoldering remains. Katarzyna had become more than legend. She had become an infection of the spirit, inhabiting bodies, rewriting lives, and every vessel proved a terrifying truth. The fire had not died with her. It still walked among men. It was the winter of 1883 when the town of Białystok first learned the meaning of Katarzyna's vengeance carried by flesh. Snow covered the roofs, the rivers froze solid, and people huddled in silence waiting for spring. But in that silence, a vessel appeared. His name was Janek, a blacksmith by trade, a quiet man who rarely spoke but whose eyes had begun to glow with something no one could explain. Neighbors swore they saw sparks leap from his hands as he worked the forge, though no coal yet burned. They claimed he stood for hours at the edge of the ruined chapel, whispering to the air as if answering a voice only he could hear. At night, villagers said they smelled smoke when he walked past, though his clothes were clean. Then came the fire. One night, without warning, the great estate of Baron Radziwiłł erupted in flames. Not just the manor, but the fields, the stables, the storehouses. Flames spread faster than wind should allow, as though the snow itself carried fire instead of water. The Baron and his family perished inside, their screams echoing through the frozen air. And at the center of it all stood Janek, untouched by the inferno, his face calm, his eyes fixed forward as if in trance. Witnesses swore the flames bent around him like soldiers obeying a command. The town was seized with terror. Some fell to their knees, calling him a prophet. Others fled, believing him possessed. The church branded him heretic, but the peasants whispered, "The bride has chosen him." Authorities tried to arrest him. Soldiers marched into the village, rifles ready. But before they reached him, their barracks burst into fire. Horses screamed as they burned in their stalls. The soldiers fled, some swearing they saw a veiled woman walking beside Janek in the smoke, her face pale, her hand resting on his shoulder. Within weeks, Białystok was half ruined, entire blocks reduced to ash as though Katarzyna herself had walked the streets, and then Janek vanished. No body was found, no grave was marked. Some said he walked into the forest and burned into nothing but cinders. Others said he wandered into another town to spread her fire anew. But the scar remained, and Białystok became a warning whispered across Poland. Beware, the bride's vessels, for where they walk, fire follows. By the late 19th century, Katarzyna's legend was no longer contained to the fields and ruins of Poland. It drifted outward, carried by refugees, by soldiers, by whispers that spread faster than any official decree. In taverns of Prussia, men spoke of a veiled bride who burned tyrants alive. In the border villages of Russia, peasants lit candles at midnight, begging her to punish cruel overseers. Even in Vienna, pamphlets appeared, anonymous, forbidden, telling of a woman who rose from the grave to ignite rebellion with her torch. The authorities feared this contagion of fire more than any army, because it was not a rebellion of guns and swords, but of minds and hearts. A ghost cannot be shot, a legend cannot be arrested. And so the rulers of Europe gathered in hushed meetings, exchanging reports of Katarzyna's fire spreading like smoke through their lands. In Prussia, officials recorded barns burned under mysterious circumstances, the owners always men of wealth accused of cruelty. In Hungary, women began to wear white veils during secret processions, daring soldiers to stop them. In Russia, entire villages refused to pay taxes, leaving smoldering ruins of collectors' homes as their only answer. The peasants whispered one phrase, again and again, "The bride walks." But the most chilling detail was this. In every report, officials noted sightings, not of cults, not of mobs, but of her, a woman in white, face hidden, veil trailing in the smoke. In Poland, in Germany, in Russia, always the same, always silent, always watching. The empires tried to stamp it out. They censored newspapers, arrested suspected cult members, executed peasants accused of arson. But the more they punished, the more Katarzyna's legend grew. For every man hanged, another swore he saw her eyes in the firelight. For every woman silenced, another took up the veil. Soon, Katarzyna was no longer a Polish myth. She was European, a spectre crossing frontiers without passport or chain, speaking the universal language of flame. To the rulers, she was chaos. To the people, she was justice. And in the dark rooms of power, one truth burned like a brand. If this fire was not contained, it could consume empires, not with armies, but with belief. And belief, once set ablaze, is impossible to extinguish. It was during the uprisings of the 1890s that Katarzyna's legend bled fully into war. Soldiers sent to crush the peasants returned not with victory, but with stories that chilled even their commanders. They spoke of battles where the enemy carried no rifles, where torches were their only weapons. Yet the armies of empire faltered, because something walked with the peasants. In one report from the Russian front, an officer described a night raid on a village. His men surrounded the barns, ready to burn the rebels out. But before they struck a match, the barn erupted in flame by itself, fire pouring out like a wave. In the glow of the blaze, he swore he saw her, a woman in white, veil untouched by flame, standing in the inferno as though it bowed to her. His men panicked, firing blindly into the night. By morning, half his company was dead, not from gunfire, but from smoke, trampled in the chaos. The rebels never raised a blade. Another soldier, hardened by years of campaign, confessed under oath that he saw Katarzyna walking between lines of troops. She passed us, he wrote, and every torch dimmed except hers. My comrades dropped their rifles, clutching their throats, as if unseen hands strangled them. He deserted the army the next day, vanishing into the forests, claiming he would rather starve than face her again. In Austria, peasants rose with scythes and pitchforks, hopeless against cavalry. Yet as the charge thundered forward, the horses reared and screamed, their eyes rolling white. The soldiers fell, crushed beneath their own beasts. Survivors swore they saw a pale figure at the tree line, veil fluttering without wind, watching with stillness colder than any steel. The church tried to call it hysteria, hallucinations from smoke and fear. But the reports kept coming, signed by officers, written in trembling hands. Too many witnesses, too much detail, men who never met, describing the same face, the same veil, the same unblinking eyes. And the most terrifying part, the peasants never claimed to see her at all. For them, she was not apparition, but presence. They fought as if invincible, chanting her name as soldiers broke before them. To the people, she was not illusion. She was command. The armies of Europe began to learn a truth they could not admit. You can kill men, you can scatter rebels, but you cannot shoot fire. And you cannot silence a bride who walks between the smoke and the dead. By the dawn of the 20th century, the rulers of Europe had more than enough reason to fear the bride. They had files, stacks of them, reports written in the shivering hands of officers, priests and governors. Too many, too consistent, too dangerous. And so the records were sealed, hidden in vaults deep beneath ministries and cathedrals, stamped with the ink of secrecy. In Berlin, officials compiled a dossier titled The Katarzyna Phenomenon. Inside, sketches drawn by soldiers who swore they had seen her face. Identical sketches from men hundreds of miles apart. Always the same. The veil, the hollow eyes, the lips that did not move yet spoke. The dossier's final note read, "To circulate this file is to spread contagion, destroy after reading." Yet the file was not destroyed. It was hidden. In St. Petersburg, the Tsar's secret police collected testimonies from deserters. Some raved of fire that followed them into their dreams. Others described marks burned into their flesh, symbols they did not carve appearing overnight. The police dismissed them as madness, but still, they wrote it down. And when a general asked why the records were kept if they were false, an archivist answered, "Because even lies can kill when men believe them." The Vatican, too, was not blind. Priests who traveled through Poland sent reports of villages where churches stood empty, but shrines to Katarzyna glowed with candles. Bishops debated whether she was a demon sent to test the faithful or something older, something beyond their scriptures. Their findings were locked away in the Archivum Secretum, where only a handful of eyes could ever see them. To this day, the files remain sealed, their very existence denied. Why hide it? Because power fears fire. but it fears belief more. To admit Katarzyna walked among soldiers would be to admit the church was powerless, the state fragile, the empire vulnerable to a myth. And so they buried the evidence. They locked the files. They silenced the witnesses. But whispers have a way of slipping through cracks. Pages torn from dossiers appeared in underground circles. Drawings smuggled from archives circulated among secret societies. Each fragment fueled the legend further. For every truth hidden, another truth-seeker was born, and Katarzyna's fire spread not only in villages, but in minds hungry for the forbidden. The rulers thought they had contained her. They had only fed her, for nothing grows stronger than a secret the world is not allowed to see. They returned from the fields of fire not as victors, not even as men, but as husks. Soldiers who had seen Katarzyna with their own eyes carried her home inside their skulls, like a disease that spread in silence. Their families knew them as different. Wives spoke of men who woke screaming in the night, clawing at their own throats as though hands of smoke were strangling them. Children whispered of fathers who stared at empty corners, muttering, "She is there. She is watching." One officer in Krakow begged to be confined, convinced he would ignite without warning. He swore that every time he closed his eyes he felt heat rising from his skin, his lungs filling with ash. The doctors dismissed him as delirious until his body was found in his cell, burned from within, the walls blackened, though no fire had touched them. Another veteran, hardened by campaigns, drank himself to death within months of returning. His journal was discovered, each page more frantic than the last. "She waits in the doorway," he wrote. "She does not blink. She knows my sins. When the fire comes, it will not come from without, but from me." His last entry was a single sentence, scrawled again and again until the ink tore the paper. "The bride has chosen me." The night he died, his cottage burned, yet his family's bodies were found unmarked, untouched, as though the flames had been selective. Across Europe, hospitals filled with these haunted men. The doctors called it hysteria, war trauma, madness. But the pattern was unmistakable. They did not dream of battle, of guns, of blood. They dreamed only of her, the veil, the eyes, the fire. Some drew her face until their fingers bled. Some carved her name into their arms. Others simply sat in silence, waiting, convinced that one day she would come to claim them. And so the armies learned a terrible truth. To fight Katarzyna was not only to risk death in battle, it was to risk carrying her back with you, into your home, into your family, into your very mind. She did not just burn the body, she burned the soul. And that was the wound no empire could heal, for a man can recover from a scar on his flesh, but who can recover from a fire that smolders forever in his dreams? When empires tried and failed to silence her, when armies could not kill her shadow, another force began to take shape, quiet, invisible, but deliberate. In the basements of crumbling monasteries, in the back rooms of taverns, in forests where the moonlight carved silver patterns on the earth, secret societies were born. They did not see Katarzyna as a curse. They saw her as a symbol, a forbidden key to power. These circles called themselves many names: the Order of Ash, Tea, He Bride's Flame, the Children of the Veil. Their members were peasants, rebels, even disillusioned nobles. They gathered by torchlight, veils draped over their faces, whispering her name as though summoning her presence. And in those circles, they swore oaths, not to God, not to king, but to her. The ceremonies were chilling. Accounts speak of brides dressed in white, walking barefoot through fire without screaming. Of grooms bound in chains, forced to kneel as vows were recited over their heads, each vow sealing the idea that marriage itself was no longer sacred, it was war. The followers of Katarzyna inverted the rituals of union, turning them into ceremonies of rebellion. Some societies claimed to possess her ashes, kept in urns passed secretly from hand to hand. Others believed her spirit moved through women chosen by fire, those who survived burns or disasters without scars. These women were revered, feared, sometimes worshipped as vessels of the bride herself. One such woman, recorded in Galicia in 1878, was said to stare into a man's eyes and cause his heartbeat to stop. The villagers called her the Veiled Daughter. The authorities hunted these groups relentlessly. Priests declared them heretical cults. Soldiers dragged their members into prisons. Judges sentenced them to death. Yet for every society exposed, another rose in its place. Because Katarzyna was more than a ghost, she was an idea, and an idea cannot be executed. The darkest claim, whispered even among the secret orders themselves, was that some of these societies were not merely honoring her. They were trying to call her back. They believed that with enough sacrifice, enough fire, the bride would return not as legend, but as flesh, to finish what she had begun. And in those whispers lies the most dangerous truth of all. She may not have vanished into myth. She may only be waiting, called forth by those who still dare to wear the veil. The church had faced heretics before. It had silenced witches, drowned prophets, burned books. But Katarzyna was different. She was not a false god whispered in the corners, nor a doctrine debated in pulpits. She was a fire, alive in memory, immune to the cross, and the priests saw with growing terror that no sermon could compete with her legend. So they devised a strategy not of confrontation but obliteration, to erase her, to smother the fire by burying every ember. In monasteries across Poland, orders were given. All records must be seized. Letters mentioning her name, pamphlets retelling her story, even legal documents from trials, taken, hidden, destroyed. Priests were instructed to deny her existence from the pulpit. If peasants spoke of the bride, they were told to laugh, to mock, to reduce her to a drunken story, a fairy tale unworthy of the faithful. But the suppression went further. In villages where cults were suspected, women were dragged from their homes at night, accused of being daughters of the veil. Some were burned, not as witches, but as warnings. In cathedrals, sermons thundered with threats of eternal damnation for those who carried her name on their lips. Children were taught prayers to shield themselves from the bride's flame. The church knew that to kill a story, one must first kill the tongue that repeats it. Yet the more they erased, the more suspicion grew. Why such fear over a myth? Why such effort to bury a ghost? In some regions, peasants noticed entire sections of parish records missing, pages cut cleanly from centuries-old ledgers. Scholars, decades later, would find gaps in archives where her story should have lived. The silence itself became evidence. And still, in the confessional booths, priests recorded chilling admissions. Brides whispering that they felt chosen, soldiers confessing to seeing her face in the smoke, peasants swearing they woke in the night to hear her laughter in the wind. No exorcism banished her. No prayer silenced her. The church thought itself a master of memory, but in erasing her, it gave her power. For nothing haunts the human mind more than the forbidden, the unspoken, the truth someone else is desperate for you to forget. Thus Katarzyna's fire smoldered, not in the open streets but in hidden hearts, buried but not dead, suppressed but not silenced. And every man of power knew the danger. A spark, even hidden underground, still waits for air. It was in the winter of 1889, in the borderlands where Poland bled into Galicia, that whispers surfaced of the most dangerous act ever attempted in Katarzyna's name. A sect known as the Veiled Circle gathered in secret, claiming they would bring her back, not as a memory, not as a legend, but as flesh and blood risen in flame. For months they prepared. Reports from hidden informants describe young women chosen for their resemblance to the bride, pale, dark-haired, solemn. They were dressed in white gowns, veils covering their faces. The men of the order built altars in the ruins of an abandoned castle, the very stones blackened by fire centuries before. Every ritual was drawn from fragments, burned manuscripts, whispered oaths, symbols carved in secret into church walls. The night came with a heavy snow. Witnesses later spoke of strange lights flashing against the storm as though fire burned beneath the ice. Villagers nearby heard chanting carried on the wind, rhythmic, rising, breaking into screams. At dawn, a black column of smoke was seen rising from the ruins. When authorities arrived, they found the aftermath. The ground was scorched. 32 bodies lay in a circle, their faces hidden beneath veils, their hands bound together by charred cloth. No weapons, no signs of struggle, yet their flesh bore marks of fire from the inside, as though something had burned them beneath their skin. And in the center of the circle was an empty coffin, untouched by flame. The church declared it mass suicide, a madness born of blasphemy. The officials burned what remained of the site, and witnesses were silenced. But rumors spread faster than edicts. Some claimed villagers had seen a figure walking away from the ruins, a woman in white, veil trailing in the snow, untouched by fire. Others said the screams heard that night were not of pain but of birth, that the 32 were not victims but offerings, that the empty coffin was not a failure but a sign. Katarzyna had risen and walked into the world again, unseen. Whether truth or delusion, the attempt only deepened her legend. For even in death, even erased from records, men and women were willing to burn themselves alive in the hope of bringing her back. And what empire, what church, what army could ever hope to destroy a faith like that? By the dawn of the 20th century, Katarzyna was no longer just a story whispered in Polish villages. Her fire had seeped into the bloodstream of Europe, igniting revolutions, riots, and uprisings in lands far beyond the fields where she once walked. She became less a ghost of one woman and more a living code, a symbol that passed between rebels as a secret signal, a forbidden language carved into banners and whispered in prisons. In the revolutions of 1905, when peasants in Russia rose against Tsarist cruelty, investigators found drawings scrawled on prison walls, crude sketches of a veiled bride standing over a burning manor. In the Paris strikes of 1910, anarchist pamphlets depicted a woman in white holding a torch, her eyes black hollows that pierced through the page. Even in the trenches of World War I, Polish soldiers spoke of her. Men dying in mud whispered that they saw a bride walking between the bodies, veil stained red, setting the sky aflame with her gaze. Everywhere rebellion rose, she was there. Not in flesh, not in body, but in symbol, in imagination. She was no longer Katarzyna alone. She was fire embodied. Some revolutionaries beager and carrying white veils as part of their banners. Others inverted wedding rituals, swearing allegiance not to a state, not to a ruler, but to the Bride of Fire. Entire cells of radicals named themselves after her. In Warsaw, secret police seized a book printed in secret presses. The cover showed a bride standing before a burning palace, the words beneath declaring, "When the veil drops, the throne falls." The rulers tried to deny it. They banned the images, arrested printers, burned the pamphlets. But once again, erasure fed the flames. Every attempt to silence her only gave her new life. And so the myth evolved. No longer bound to the story of a single Polish bride, she became the faceless, eternal bride of rebellion. In Spain, in Hungary, in Italy, they spoke of her not as a ghost, but as destiny. She was the spark that returned whenever men dared to believe their oppressors could bleed. The great irony is this: those who tried hardest to bury her name gave her immortality. Because rebellion does not die in silence. It breeds there. And Katarzyna's fire, once set, had no master. It leapt across borders, across generations, across languages, until she was no longer theirs to contain. She belonged to history itself. The 20th century was supposed to kill the old ghosts. Industry, electricity, science, these were meant to replace superstition. Yet in the bloodiest age of human history, the bride was seen again. Not in fairy tales, but in wars. Not in legends, but in reports. In 1939, as Poland was carved apart by two empires, soldiers on both sides swore to seeing her. A German diary recovered from the ruins of Warsaw contained an entry. "We burned the village at dawn. The flames spread too fast, as though guided by hands unseen. Amid the smoke I saw a woman in white. She did not run. She did not scream. She only looked at me, and the fire grew taller. I shot, but the bullet passed through her veil." In the Soviet advance of 1944, a Red Army officer confessed before his death that his men refused to enter certain ruins, claiming they saw a veiled woman standing in the doorway. His superior dismissed it as hysteria until the house ignited the next night, killing the entire squad that slept inside. Only ashes remained. The sightings did not stop with the war. In 1968, during student uprisings in Prague, photographs circulated briefly before being seized. One showed a line of students facing tanks. Behind them, blurred by motion, a figure in white seemed to walk untouched through the chaos. Witnesses later whispered, "She was there. We all saw her." Even into the late 20th century, her shadow appeared in disasters. Survivors of a massive fire in a Soviet factory swore that moments before the blaze erupted, a veiled woman walked calmly through the machines, leaving no trace. In Chernobyl, 2 workers claimed they saw her by Reactor 4 the night of the meltdown, standing still as the alarms screamed. They did not survive to testify further. Of course, officials dismissed it all. Mass hysteria, collective trauma, misidentified figures. Yet the reports piled higher than they could erase. Soldiers, workers, students, unconnected, decades apart, swore they had seen the same woman, the same veil, the same fire. By the close of the century, one terrifying truth had taken root. Katarzyna was not a relic of the 1800s. She had become something else, a presence that adapted, that survived, that followed humanity into every new war, every uprising, every disaster. And if she still walked through the fire in the 20th century, then what does that mean for us, now, in the present? Psychologists, desperate to cage her within the language of science, began calling Katarzyna not a ghost, but an archetype. They argued she was the embodiment of something buried in the human collective unconscious, an eternal symbol of suppressed rage. They said every society builds prisons for its people, duty, marriage, obedience, silence. And when those prisons crack, when pressure builds past the breaking point, the fire must find a face. The bride, they said, is that face. To the oppressed, she becomes vengeance incarnate. To women crushed under the weight of obedience, she becomes rebellion. To men broken under tyrants, she becomes destruction of the throne. She is not a woman, they claimed. She is the eruption that happens when the human spirit can no longer bear its chains. One psychiatrist compared her to a mirror that appears only when society refuses to look at itself. She does not exist in flesh, yet she exists in fire, in uprising, in dreams. Every time humanity reaches a threshold of cruelty, her veil slips back into view. Every time corruption builds too high, she walks through the flames. But there is a darker twist. Some modern theorists whisper that if Katarzyna is an archetype, she is not born from us at all. Rather, we are born into her. That she is not a story created by rebellion, but rebellion itself is her eternal body. When peasants rose in 1860, she was there. When workers struck in 1910, she was there. When students faced tanks, she was there. And when fire returns, she will return again. This interpretation terrifies more than any ghost story, because if she is an archetype, then she cannot be killed, she cannot be erased, she is not memory, she is pattern, which means her veil is destined to fall again, no matter how many archives are burned, no matter how many mouths are silenced. And perhaps that is the greatest horror of all, that she is not outside us, but inside us. That every man who feels the weight of chains, every woman who hears the door of a prison close, carries her spark in silence, and when the time comes, the spark will ignite. She is not the past. She is the future. And now, you must ask yourself, why have you followed me this far into the fire? Why did your ears not turn away when the veil dropped, when the screams echoed, when the ashes fell? Perhaps it is because, deep inside, you already knew. You already sensed that her story was not dead history, not dusty myth, not folklore to entertain children. No, the bride has always been here, watching, waiting, walking. Look around you. Do you not see the same patterns repeating? Governments tightening chains under the guise of safety, corporations demanding obedience in exchange for survival, institutions demanding silence while corruption spreads like rot. You call this modern, you call this progress. But Katarzyna's fire whispers the truth. You are still living in the same prison. Only the walls have changed their shape. The officials of the 19th century tried to erase her name. Today, the new officials erase truth itself. Your screens are curated, your news filtered, your thoughts guided by invisible hands. And yet, the same pressure builds, the same weight presses down, and when chains tighten too far, the bride always returns. So perhaps she is already walking among us, perhaps in the quiet corners of protest, in the silence before riots break, in the despair of men who can no longer kneel. She is there, veiled, unseen, waiting for the spark. Perhaps in the next fire that sweeps a city, in the next scream that pierces the night, someone will swear they saw her, not in legend, not in archives, but with their own eyes. And if you doubt, if you dismiss, if you laugh, remember this: every empire laughed before it burned, every throne mocked the whisper before it collapsed, and every man who claimed she was only a story felt the heat of her gaze in his last moment. Now I leave you with a question that you cannot bury, a question that will haunt you tonight and tomorrow, and every time you hear the crackle of fire. Is she still walking? And if she is, when she turns her eyes toward you, will you be the oppressor chained to the flames, or the spark that lights the darkness? Choose wisely, because the bride has already chosen.